Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting Helen and I to be with you at Cutsike Christian Church this morning. Unfortunately, we can't be with you in person, but it is a great pleasure to be invited and to join with you in this way that we've all become accustomed to in the past year. I'm going to begin this morning just by reading a few verses from Nehemiah chapter 9, beginning at the second half of verse 5 and moving on from there. Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be your glorious name, which is exalted above all blessing and praise. You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them, and you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you. You are the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you, and made with him the covenant to give to his offspring the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. And you have kept your promise, for you are righteous. And you saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt, and heard their cry at the Red Sea, and performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers. And you made a name for yourself, as it is to this day. And you divided the sea before them, so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and you cast their pursuers into the depths, as a stone into mighty waters. By a pillar of cloud you led them in the day, and by a pillar of fire in the night, to light for them the way in which they should go. You came down on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right rules, and true laws, and good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath, and commanded them commandments and statutes, and a law by Moses your servant. You gave them bread from heaven for their hunger, and brought water for them out of a rock for their thirst. And you told them to go in to possess the land you had sworn to give them. But they and our fathers acted presumptuously, and stiffened their neck, and did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey, and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them, but they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. So, as I understand it from Paul, you've just finished a season where you've been studying the book of Nehemiah. So you've already followed the continuation of the story of the Jewish exiles who returned to their homeland after Babylonian captivity in Ezra. So the book of Ezra documents a group of around 50,000 returnees to Judah in the first year of Cyrus the Great, conqueror of Babylon in about 538-539 BC. And the temple at Jerusalem was rebuilt by this returning group. Ezra himself led about 1,500 more people back some years later, and all this occurred sometime in the mid-5th century BC. Ezra's spiritual leadership during this time led to vital reform in Judah. Those who'd married foreign women divorced them, and they recommitted themselves as a people to their covenant relationship with God. Now, the events recorded in the book of Nehemiah form part of the same story. It's a follow-on from Ezra, as you know. They take place a few years later, around 446 BC. Nehemiah becomes a governor appointed to lead his people with the express purpose of rebuilding the walls of the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, I'm sure you had a very interesting time covering the book, and what I don't want to do this morning, what I don't intend to do this morning, is to turn around and revisit the same ground. But I'd like to offer some thoughts following on from some of the themes of Nehemiah and about what has been on my heart in the past 18 months to a year, on the hearts of Helen and I at home, and the heart of our church, All Saints in Sheffield. And there's a common thread that runs through these thoughts of false divides, but we will cover a lot of ground this morning. So kind of apologies in one sense for that, but I hope that in doing so and in sharing some of the thoughts that relate to some of the things that go on in Nehemiah, some of the things that have been on our heart as a couple and as a church, there might be something in there for everyone. Something that I scratch at might give pause for reflection or for prayer. in everyone's life. So I'm aware that as we go through this, we'll be going at quite a pace, and there is much more that could be said and much more to unpack in a lot of this. And for that, I don't apologise, and I just suggest that these are things that you might pick up in your own studies at a later date. Now, as you've no doubt already covered, the histories recorded in Nehemiah and Ezra were quite possibly required for the sake of reporting activities back to the king of Persia as they went out back to Judah. However, the accounts from our point of view and from the point of view of post-exilic Israel also highlight the faithfulness of Yahweh to the people. The nation had been deported, they'd lost their promised land, the nation, the temple, the Davidic dynasty, they were all gone. Their identity as a covenant people of God had been shocked to the core when that happened. This trauma then fostered a new understanding of God working in the world and a reworking of theology for the people. The universalism of God working in the world, his providence, his power, his connection, his relationship to creation, in working through the kings and governments of the world, of the earth, of creation itself is all highlighted. And it's welcome news of Yahweh's rule of human activity for the ultimate benefit of his elect to those who had returned to Judah. The accounts also detail the ministries of both Ezra and Nehemiah in restoring Jerusalem physically and spiritually, affirming the promises of God to restore and renew the remnant of Israel. The dominant theme then is one of covenant renewal in the post-exilic community, a call to spiritual renewal and social justice by these two reformers, Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's aimed at correcting misconduct in the returned remnant, of installing hope in them and boosting their morale. And it follows the standard pattern of the historical books in the Old Testament. The despairing community need to grasp that obedience to the requirements of the covenant is a prerequisite to the blessing of Yahweh and to their restoration. The further framing of the return from Babylonian exile as a new exodus by the chronicler reinforces this link between the pre- and the post-exilic communities and the continuation of this covenant relationship. This theological truth of God as covenant keeper underpins the labours of both Ezra and Nehemiah. And it's explicit in part of the recounting, remembrance and the words of Nehemiah 9. So Nehemiah 9 verse 32, the people remind themselves, "Now therefore our God, the great, the mighty and the awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love." It's this faithfulness of God to his word, to his covenant, that focused the post-exilic prophets to give messages of hope and encouragement. And perhaps more important was the impetus of these servants of God to trust God that God would accomplish feats that would serve as concrete manifestations of Yahweh's covenant keeping. So Ezra and Nehemiah are involved in the reconstruction of the Second Temple, the repair of the Jerusalem city wall, concrete examples of God's covenant keeping. And implicit in this idea of God's sovereign rule that runs throughout Ezra and Nehemiah material are two kind of further theological truths that are really important for the post-exilic community. The first is that the people can have a hope in the present work of God because of the model of Yahweh's participation in their history. So because of what has gone before, because God has shown himself to be faithful to the covenant before, the people can have a present hope that God will work on their behalf for the community of Israel. The second is that the ministry of Ezra and Nehemiah themselves attests to God's ability to raise up servants to accomplish his purpose, his goals, and to fulfill his promises. And so we come to the first of our divides, a divide between prayer on the one hand and action on the other. So Nehemiah is raised up by God, and his request to the king to oversee the rebuilding project is explicitly, in the words of the chronicler, ordained by God. And that's referenced for us in Nehemiah 2 verses 8. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Trusting God, however, Nehemiah still followed the practical path, and he obtained the permission of the king, and through that gained cavalry and horsemen to support him as he went forth in Nehemiah 2 and verse 9. And this approach is quite different to the approach that Ezra took in his work for God. Ezra believed that trusting God and being faithful meant that he shouldn't ask for royal protection. Conversely, Nehemiah requested this provision on the understanding of the universality of God, that God was working, that the offer of such protection was evidence of Yahweh at work, rather than some kind of lack of faith in the work of God. And this itself begs questions about what it means to do the work of God and the different conclusions that might be drawn by different people. Possibly each of them, Ezra and Nehemiah, were doing what came naturally, given their history, learning, and their skills. Ezra was a priest scribe, familiar with the presence of God. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king, familiar with the function of the royal court. Both were seeking to be faithful in their work, but the understanding of trusting God and working out his purpose for each of them was understandably slightly different. Nehemiah was particularly pragmatic, and yet trusting in the will of God at the same time. In Jerusalem, ahead of announcing his plans, he surveys the work that needs to be done. He goes out at night, in Nehemiah 2 verse 13. Then, upon announcing his plans and receiving challenge from the people, he responds actually that it's faith in God, and his faith in God, and God's action that will aid them in Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 20. The God of heaven, says Nehemiah, is the one who will give us success. Nehemiah goes on and he delegates where necessary in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, when faced with preparation for battle, he both sets a guard, practically, but also sets himself and the people to prayer. And the simple false divide here is between actively pursuing our own agenda and passively waiting for God to act. Nehemiah models what a real, practical, solid, living faith should look like. This divide should be unnatural to us. Prayer should be like a rhythm and a pattern in our lives. Jesus gave an example in the Lord's Prayer and said you should pray like this, after this fashion and rhythm and pattern. The example that we're given in the Lord's Prayer should point and direct us in our set prayers, our corporate prayers, and our personal prayers. And it should point us, it's not a form, it's not a rigid prayer to be read out, but it's to be used as a pattern for prayer, as an integral part of Christian existence. Early Christians used this pattern given by Jesus. They elaborated it, they adapted it in exactly that kind of way, and that's why we see the different versions in Matthew and in Luke. And so in our own faith lives, in our own working out of what it means to be faithful to God, in working out what it is that we should be doing before God, we should seek to be people who are naturally looking to him, seeking him in his majesty as the provider and source, guide and father. And from that pattern, from that rhythm of prayer, from that prayer being as natural as an ongoing conversation, our present walk and actions and struggles and efforts and our creativity for God should flow. And so we come on to our second divide, the divide between the sacred and the secular. So it's interesting to note in these narratives that Ezra functions in the role of a priest scribe. So it becomes the model for a later class of religious professionals that don't really exist at this point. But as Hebrew society is restructured post-exile, it's Ezra who becomes that model, and ends up being that model for what we see in the New Testament in terms of the scribes and the priesthood. It's Ezra who leads the temple rebuilding and begins teaching and reform for the returning remnant of Israel. Now, by contrast to that, Nehemiah is a trusted official. He's the one who comes, he exercises political power as an advisor and a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. He's neither priest nor prophet, he's simply a layman. The temple might appear on the surface to be a religious institution, while the walls are a secular one. However, it's God leading Nehemiah to work on the walls, no less than he's leading Ezra to work on the temple. Both the sacred and the secular were necessary to fulfill God's plan to restore the nation of Israel. If the walls are left unfinished, the temple is unfinished too. The work is a single piece. And the reason for this is easy to understand. Without a wall, no city in the ancient Near East was going to be safe from bandits, gangs, and wild animals, even though the empire itself might be at peace. The more economically and culturally developed a city was, the greater value of things in the city and the greater the need for the wall. The temple, with its rich decoration, would be particularly at risk. Practically speaking, no wall means no city, and no city means no temple. Now, conversely, to the mind of Israel, the city and its wall depend on the temple as a source of God's provision for law, government, security, and prosperity. The wall is an integral part of the city's protection, yet so is the temple. It's the dwelling place of God. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. These are the words from Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 to 3. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And it's this same God who thwarts the violent plans of the city's enemies in Nehemiah, following the Samaritan plotting. In Nehemiah 4:15 we have recorded, when our enemies heard that it was known to us, this plotting, this plan, and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. So no temple means no presence of God, and no presence of God means no military strength, no justice, no civilization, and no need for walls. The temple and the walls are united in a society founded on God's covenant and steadfast love. The connection between the temple and the wall is significant for our theology of work. In the book of Nehemiah, it's the layman, focused on God's plan, who is accomplishing the task at hand. In one sense, he gives up a stable job at the palace at Shushan, and he gives up the protection of the king. However, it's Nehemiah's expertise in the king's court that equips him to be adequate for the political and the physical reconstruction necessary for this remnant to survive in Jerusalem. This picture of the intertwined temple and wall, of the sacred and the secular being part of the same piece of work, of being necessary for one another, begs the question of us, and it invites us to interrogate our own sacred and secular divide. Where do our own lines, explicit and implicit, get drawn between what we consider working for God and what we consider the necessary work of being in the world? We can all echo the thoughts that all work, all the exercise of good gifts and skills, our worship, all to God's glory. But how is it actually furthering God's plan? What is our intention and our vision in doing those things? As a church, in the building, at home, at school, in Zoom or on Facebook or on YouTube, whatever it might be, in this liminal space that we're in, we're called to bring a foretaste of heaven. And this liminal space is the now and the not yet. It's a place of change. It's the kingdom that is and is to come, as Jesus describes it. What are we doing to make that concrete? What are we doing to bring that foretaste of heaven, to make that concrete in the places in which we work, in the places in which we live, in our church today? What are we doing to make it real in our society, to bring spiritual renewal and real social justice? As we ourselves return, whatever that's going to look like in the coming months, are we doing so with God's purpose at the forefront of our minds? Or are we doing so looking for the comfortable, the familiar, and the normal? In the text of Nehemiah, the reality for the remnant of Israel was it was a new work and faith. The old could never and would never return. The land was gone. It was occupied by different people. The priesthood and the kingly lines were lost. The people were under Persian rule. They were never going to have another king of the Davidic line. what does our return look like? What needs to change? What needs to remain the same? What is our covenant that we need to continue? And what are the things that we need to leave behind and to change? And so we come on to our next divide, the last divide, the divide between the natural and the spiritual. And I wanted to include this because this divide of the sacred and the secular, it alludes to this divide of the natural and the spiritual. It alludes to this dualism between what we see as normal and of the world and what is spiritual, what is other. And by extension, that gives us a distinction between body and soul. And it's something that we've been, as part of our studies over the past year, wrestling with several times in our church in Sheffield. I'll try to allude to some of why that is as we go through. So this connection between the natural and the spiritual, between the sacred and the normal, it was tacitly understood by Israel in the past. And it actually finds representation, in the temple itself. The Hebrew understanding of the temple and the tabernacle was in part a representation of creation, both the spiritual and the natural. Significantly, we know that the temple was separated into two parts: the Holy of Holies from the holy place, and it represented the visible and invisible creation, as well as, by the time of Jesus, the present and eternity, or a timeless state. The Hebrew words for hidden and eternity, they share the same root, and in temple cosmology, hidden and eternity were not distinguished. The hidden world of the divine, of the spiritual, was within creation. It wasn't beyond it and separated from it. So often we think of the world as broken and hopeless, and we look to spiritual escape and the future of heaven. It's a thing to look forward to hope for. But in the narrative of Genesis 1, we see God creating a good creation, one with inherent worth and a future, spelled out in Revelation 11:15, 18, chapter 21, verses 1 to 3. And we should also note that the same is true for the God in flesh of the incarnation, and then the new post-resurrection body of Jesus. It's not a replacement of the past, but it's an identification with it and a regeneration of it. Now, if we start to grasp this idea that it's not replacement, but it's regeneration, it's hope, it has huge implications for the way we live in our world and our local context, the way we think about how we deal with resources, our diet, our consumption, our fuel, our clothing, all part of the care and regeneration of creation in the here and now, being in that liminal space. It should even impact the way we think about ourselves and those around us, as it has massive implications for body image, for normative body values, and for the disabled. This value in worth is important in another way as well. Note that God in creation calls the different parts of creation good, and it's based on them being and existing. It's intrinsic to what they are. The value they have is not in the extrinsic value of work or productivity. And this too can teach us an awful lot. In our Western lives, we occupy a world where value is based on productivity and success. It's on job progression, pay rises, education, home ownership, car ownership, so on, so on, and so on. From this kind of behaviour follows instrumentalisation of the land and the plants and the things around us. They become commodities to be consumed and used. They've only got value in what they can produce or what can be obtained from them. And this idea is completely antithetical to a God-centric picture of creation and the theology of work we just described. Our work, our labour, our serving, our creating, whatever it might be, it must be held in balance with simply being and communing and praying. That itself is a vital act of recovering our intrinsic worth. More than that even though, Scripture as a whole points to the fact that the wider creation outside of human experience has relationship with God too. It isn't just about covenant relationship with Israel, nor a new covenant relationship in the blood of Jesus to us as a church today. The Bible is ahistoric, and it's human-focused, it's anthropocentric. The story of humanity's relationship with God is revealed to us in the Bible. It's a work that is targeted to humanity, but it's not exhaustive as regards the relationship of God. The land itself praises God in Psalm 148. Creation in total groans in expectation of regeneration and rebirth in Romans 8:19-22. The secret lives of animals take place before God's eyes and under his provision. So I suggest that if we want to balance our work, our faith, our home life, and our relationship to the world, then we have to strive to understand them as interconnected and interdependent. As we look to what our return will be in the next few weeks and months, as we look to what our priorities should be, as we look to the work that God is calling to us, we must realise and recognise and be mindful of the fact that we are part of a wider community of creation. We are within the sovereign work and actions of God, and that is a great blessing. That's a great hope. We each have a purpose. We each have skills and attributes that have been given to us by God to work out his will in our sphere. What will we do that's intentional to make sure that happens? We each have intrinsic honour and value. We can be loved. We can be wanted. We can find a home in Christ simply by being who we are, because we have that honour and value as part of creation. I hope some of these thoughts have been a blessing this morning, and I do hope that we'll see you all soon. God bless.